we as Americans have to recognize that other countries are fiercely going after hydrogen, both the fuels, the electrolyzers, all the components, and we have an opportunity to lead.
Hi, I'm Jacob Susman, and welcome to the Great Green Upgrade. On today's episode, we have Miranda Ballentine. Miranda and I got to work together closely when she was the CEO of the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance, and she has had a long track record in the sustainability field. Today, we're going to be talking about how we really get the flywheel going on large purchases of clean hydrogen and derivative fuels. Miranda, great to have you with us. Boy, you've had such interesting roles across the sustainability marketplace and ecosystem, and all of them kind of lead back to this concept of transformative leadership. So take me back to some of the early days that you moved in this direction and walk us up to today. How do you think about being a transformational leader in sustainability?
So listen, transformation obviously doesn't happen on its own. It doesn't happen from a single person. It really requires a team and requires understanding who the key leaders are that are required to bring the transformation about. And I like to recall this story from Lee Scott, who was the CEO of Walmart at the time. He was speaking at the Walmart Sustainability Summit, so had thousands and thousands of Walmart employees, both in the room and on video. And he said, sustainability is really not an option at Walmart. And I know that we have three kinds of employees, and he called them the three A's. He said, we've got the active. Those are the folks that are really excited about this transformation. They're on board. They're building sustainability into their day-to-day jobs, and they don't need much convincing. They needed that leadership top cover. Then there are the agnostic. That's the second A. And the agnostic are the folks who sort of say, well, if the CEO says we're going this way, this is the way I'm going to go. And so they get on board and come along. And the third A are the annoyed. These are the folks who say, why are we doing this anyway? How does this relate to our core mission as an organization? And he said to the Walmart staff, he said, look, if you're in the annoyed category, you're not going to get very far in the company because this is really important to who we are as and our future. But I love that anecdote because the three A's have stuck with me over time. And what I've realized is that a lot of us spend a lot of time trying to convince the annoyed about why we need to have a transformation and how the transformation is going to be good for them. And I've realized you actually don't need to do that. If you can truly get the active people activated and passionate and moving forward, you can drive transformation even when the annoyed remain annoyed. I'll give you one more little tidbit on this question of transformation because I think it's an important concept no matter what you're working on, whether it's bringing about another clean energy technology like clean hydrogen, whether it is energy security or American prosperity. If you're trying to drive transformation, I love this idea of the trim tab. Jake, I don't know, are you a sailor or a pilot?
I love being a passenger on a sailboat, but no, I'm afraid you can't trust me anywhere near the various aspects of actually piloting the thing.
Okay, so those of you in the audience who are sailors or pilots, you already know what a trim tab is, but bear with me while I describe it to the rest of the audience. The trim tab is like a little bitty rudder on the big rudder. So if you think of a massive ship, whether it's Walmart or the United States Air Force or the US economy, whatever you're trying to shift, a massive shift, you're going to have to change the rudder. Same thing on an aircraft wing. You have to change the angle of the wing to change the angle of your aircraft. Well, even changing the rudder on a ship that big is really hard and really slow. That's why there's this thing called a trim tab, which is a little tiny rudder on the big rudder. And if you can change the direction of the trim tab, it changes the direction of the rudder and it changes the direction of the ship. And those of us who are in the business of transforming something, our companies, our economies, ourselves, we sometimes can feel like just one player in a massive ecosystem. But if you can see yourself as the trim tab, you can change the whole rudder and change the whole ship. That's how transformation happens.
Both those analogies are incredible for our topics today, Miranda. I mean, that's precisely what we're trying to do around green molecules with
Mhm.
clean hydrogen, but also with derivative fuels like sustainable aviation fuel or shipping fuel or clean ammonia for that matter. And we're looking for the active, not the annoyed. And we're looking for people who are willing to serve that role of being the trim tab, kind of to get their companies just moving slightly in that direction as we kind of affect this broader transformation. So spot on. And I'll ask you to go a level deeper. So what was it like? I mean, Walmart was the first to sign one of these, now famous virtual power purchase agreements. It had to be really hard to convert the annoyed and get the rest of the crew sort of motivated in order to take this risk and go through this effort on something new. How did you bring people on side?
Well, look, I want to make sure that I'm not taking credit when credit is not due. So by the time I joined Walmart, Lee Scott had already set the world's first 100% renewable energy goal, zero waste to landfill goal, and sustainable products goal. And it certainly helps to have the CEO set really ambitious goals for the company. In fact, it's really a prerequisite, but that alone won't do it. Particularly if the CEO is more of a figurehead. In the case of Walmart, Lee Scott was a very beloved CEO, and people took his goals very seriously. So having that top leadership committed to a high level of ambition is really, really important. What I found though is the sort of upper middle management, kind of the VP and SVP level. Those folks are the most critical layer that can't be in the annoyed category. Those are the folks who own the purse strings. Those are the folks who are taking these ambitions and these strategies from the C-suite and actually turning them into action while meeting business objectives. And so that is the strata that's really important in a large organization to get excited about the product, about the transformation. Often it requires aligning the solution with their core business objectives. In fact, it always requires that. And often it requires piloting, particularly for newer technologies. And coming back to hydrogen, way back in 2008, 2009, when I was at Walmart, we were experimenting with hydrogen fuel cell powered what we call pallet jacks, or they call pallet jacks, but are essentially our forklifts. They
Mhm.
move pallets of goods around a distribution center. Um, it's one thing to have a hydrogen fuel cell that has been tested in a lab. It's something very different to put it in a Walmart distribution center, having it go in and out of we had really specialized sort of refrigerated cases to prevent bananas from ripening too fast, for example. You need to make sure that the technologies actually work in the real world environment in which they'll be operating. And you have drivers of these vehicles. They actually need to try them out and they need to see what it's like to refuel it as opposed to using a lead acid battery pallet jack, which is what they've been used to previously. Similarly, when I was the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, we had a really, really interesting pilot project out at Hickam Air Force Base where we retrofitted all of the non tactical vehicles on the base, used solar, so talking about clean hydrogen, used solar to make the hydrogen to then power the hydrogen fuel cell non-tactical vehicles. And when you think non-tactical, that includes everything from sort of buses and cars all the way through to the weapons loader. So that's the vehicle that actually takes a weapon out of storage and loads it onto an aircraft. And all these vehicles were now hydrogen powered with hydrogen that was created from a solar array. And all of these pilots and experiments are really designed to make sure that the user has a good experience with the technology and it meets not only the objectives in a laboratory test, but in a real world setting. And it's very hard to do that until you actually get onto the plant of a company or an organization.
Those are really crystal kind of images to think about how some of these initial setups can get going and get off the ground. And I love what
Yeah.
you said about developing champions kind of in the upper middle ranks of management within these companies. Because we're talking about industrial gases companies, oil majors, uh, y- giant fertilizer manufacturers, airlines. These are industries that are responsible for people's safety in some instances, that have a zero fault tolerance. And you're asking people to go outside their comfort zone. So showing them that pilot and here's how it's worked is critically important. But just honestly, also developing a very frank dialogue with people so they'll tell you, look, here are the things that concern me, but here are the things that my management get excited about. Let's partner and find a way to kind of come up with a solution to really transform things.
That's absolutely right. And you just touched on something that I don't think we talk enough about, and that is the relationship that humans have with the technologies that they've been using for years, sometimes decades. And often, those of us in the clean tech space will talk about lining up three legs of a stool. We'll talk about lining up the technology readiness with financial readiness and an economic storyline that works, with policy and getting the right policy framework to support a technology. And we sort of talk about this trifecta, like if we can get those three things, it's all going to just magically work. But what that misses is the fourth leg of the stool that you just mentioned, Jake, which is that relationship that humans have with technologies and the inertia behind those relationships, particularly those individuals who do have either an economic requirement for their job or the health and safety of their colleagues or their staff as part of their job. And so shifting that inertia is just like any other inertia. A body in motion stays in motion unless you have an outside intervening force to shift the direction. And so you really need that outside force. And that might be simply a CEO saying we're going in a different direction. That might be a law requiring you to go in a different direction. That might be such a strong economic driver, but typically I don't find that an economic driver alone is enough to do it. It really does take um, courage. It takes a person to be the trim tab and the person inside the organization who's willing to say, we've had this relationship with this technology for decades. It's working for us and we're going to try something new. And that's a really, really tricky piece of the puzzle, and we don't talk about it enough.
Well said, Miranda. And you've described kind of the moment when the flywheel got going for the direct purchasing of renewable power from wind and solar plants by corporates. And you were
That's right.
front and center for that. You were out and out leading the charge. So tell us a little bit more about that moment when that sort of inertia kind of began, and how do we replicate that? How do we get the flywheel going in clean hydrogen?
Oh, gosh. I wish I had all the answers for this, Jake. You know, in the early days at Walmart, and I'm not even sure we knew at the time how far ahead of the curve we were. We did one of the first two rooftop solar power purchase agreements in 2008. No, I'm sorry. The first utility scale wind was in 2008. We did the first rooftop solar PPA around 2005, 2006. And those first PPAs, the first rooftop solar PPA at Walmart took about 18 months to go from idea to bringing it to action. The second one happened in about 6 months, and then the next 100 happened in the next 6 or 12 months.
Amazing.
So the pace was very high once the shift of inertia happened. And it really does come down to those brave leaders. Kim Saylor's Laster. I don't know if you know Kim Saylor's Laster. I think she is an unsung hero in the clean energy movement because she really was the one, and she was at that perfect level. She was the vice president of energy at Walmart at the time for Walmart US. And it really just required conversations, a lot of trust. Kim had been with the company for years and years, actually decades at that point. She was at that right level where she's matching the CEO's vision with the strategy and implementation. And it just took a lot of conversations and a lot of spreadsheets and a lot of questions to answer. It's not that exciting. It's kind of the boring business stuff. So is this a lease? Is it an ownership? Is it all that stuff?
Yeah, and a certain amount of chutzpah, I think, as well, and a willingness to not take no for an answer, I'm sure.
That's right.
Well, and there's got to be something in it for those internal champions who take on the mantle of I'm going to lead on this. I'm going to stick my neck out a little bit for it. What do you think is sort of in it for those individuals, and more importantly, what's in it for the companies? Does it have a corporate strategy benefit, a brand benefit? Does it help with recruiting? Why do companies decide to really take these steps?
Okay, so Jake, you're absolutely right. If you're a large energy consumer, you paid your utility bill every month, you haven't really thought about it in terms of why would I buy something different? Why would I do something different? In fact, most companies, most organizations model their electricity spend along with their growth. It's just a rider that comes along with their growth. At some point, most companies, most organizations start to realize that the utility bill, the electricity bill, the gas bill, the fuel bill is actually a controllable expense. And they don't need to have it tied with growth. And what you're seeing is more and more mature companies disaggregating their energy spend with their growth. And that alone is a transformation. It's thinking very differently about what is a controllable expense versus what is an expense that just happens to you as part of your growth. So many companies get into this because they care about the climate crisis. Some get into it because they see that signing long-term power purchase agreements with a fuel source that has a steady cost and doesn't have the volatility of some of the natural resource-based fuels can provide them some hedge against future energy costs. And more, what we're starting to see are some industries in particular focusing on things like energy resilience. How can I ensure that if the grid goes down, my operation, whether it's running a big data center or a grocery store that has millions of dollars of frozen food stock that they don't want to freeze, or a university that may have um, 30,000-year-old ice cores that they're studying that must remain frozen, or cells that must remain frozen. No matter what industry you're in, there's a huge value to resilience, and more companies are seeing that angle as well as they're thinking about managing their energy better.
Let me take that a step further, maybe across a range of industries. Wouldn't brand be a factor, and sort of demonstrating that your brand is about a certain purpose or a certain image? Is recruiting a factor, and trying to attract the best and the brightest? And in general, sort of just illustrating a company's focus on innovation and doing sort of more forward-thinking things? Do those factor in when a company decides, "Hey, I'm gonna give clean hydrogen a try"?
Sure. And I would say it's going to vary by company. There are
Yeah.
some companies who have always been on the bleeding edge of innovation across all aspects that touch their business, even if they're not energy companies. And so those companies, of course, are always looking to break their own inertia and try something new that's going to have cost benefit, be good for their customers, be good for their shareholders. But I do have to say that that is not true for all companies. There are other companies who would really rather be in the fast follower category. So they might want the Fortune 10 to be proving that a hydrogen fuel cell forklift or, hydrogen to power anything or hydrogen as a fuel source is going to work. So I wouldn't say that reputation and brand value drives every organization, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It really depends on where a company sees itself in that ecosystem.
Fair. And now go a level deeper, specifically down into the clean fuels area, as opposed to electricity. So, with respect to jet fuel, for example, there's this interesting dynamic where you've had big corporates like Microsoft step in and support some of these uh, sustainable aviation fuels that have deals that have been announced. And then on the shipping side, you have big retailers, folks like Amazon and Target, Walmart as well, who are applying not so gentle pressure on their shippers to also procure more of these clean fuels to move products around the world. Those companies, though, have been a little slower to sort of take up the mantle. Uh, do you have any advice for particularly pioneers inside those companies who are trying to build support and who want to be active in driving in this direction, how they can kind of build an alliance both internally and externally to get that flywheel going?
Yeah, I'd say that we should be taking a page from the playbook of the other industries, as you noted with solar. Something that you know intimately well from some of your prior endeavors. Um, Individuals within organizations that need sustainable fuels, that want sustainable fuels, need to be working together, particularly at the beginning, need to be providing that. I call it projects 1 through 10. It's that 1 through 10 last valley of death after the technology's been through the labs, and hydrogen is even beyond that at this point, right? We're beyond that last valley of death for projects 1 through 10. But technologies need that proving ground. So finding ways to work with other companies to say, let's test this out in our facilities and then look at what are the barriers. Let me give you an example from my time in the Air Force with sustainable aviation fuel. Um, the Air Force had actually flown every single one of our aircraft on a version of SAF, sustainable aviation fuel, many, 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 many years ago. That actually happened during George W. Bush's administration, where they tested every single aircraft flying on sustainable aviation fuel, which was amazing. And there's all kinds of great videos from those days. Okay, well, fast forward to today. Why are we not flying all military aircraft on sustainable aviation fuel? We know they can do it. Um, we know that it's good for the American economy. We know that it's good for diversifying our fuel. Well, as it turns out, on American air bases, we not only have American aviation or aircraft, but we have aircraft of all of our allies as well. Well, our allies are a little bit slower on the uptake, and they haven't tested all of their aircraft, which are not exactly the same as our aircraft. And we only have a certain number of fuel tanks. So we can't have sustainable aviation fuel for our jets and something else for someone else's jets. So the barriers often end up being different than you think that they might be. So finding those areas of tension, the barriers, and then breaking those down is really the key. But
Love
if
it.
I want to start the process, finding allies in other companies, whether it's the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance or the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance or the Renewable Thermal Collaborative, building these collaboratives where you can build that demand signal together, try out the technologies across different types of industries together, that will really help drive down the risk in the technology and drive down the cost in the technology.
Excellent advice. So far, I'm hearing a lot of focus on engaging champions and pioneers, running pilots so people start to develop a comfort with the tech and with the overall process, but then building alliances and having other people to lean on and not having to go it alone. Um, Sort of sounds like navigating a career to some degree.
That is true. That is true. But a key thing though is after the pilot, understanding, okay, now what's the barrier? Because once you've proven the technology, now what's the barrier?
Yeah.
And it may be in strange places that you don't anticipate.
Yeah. Well, speaking of one that we have maybe emerging now, but it was this way, early on in wind and solar power too. There's a fair amount of policy uncertainty around kind of clean fuels and clean hydrogen emerging from the debate that we're about to have about the Inflation Reduction Act. And, there will be other policy uncertainty that will come up around, as we're trying to get these sectors off the ground. So, do you have any insights from your past of, maybe when the PTC or the ITC was set to expire, for example, how you kind of keep your focus and barrel through some of those moments of uncertainty?
Well, it's tough, as you know. I mean, I wish I had a good answer for this one. But the reality is you can't separate the policy environment from the business environment. We love to talk about the private sector and let's let the private sector do its thing and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is the private sector operates within the bounds of the policy environment. There is no separating the two. And policymakers have always been a critical linchpin in greasing the wheels for next generation technologies that aren't yet ripe and mature enough to compete with the technologies that are decades or sometimes centuries old. So it's a really critical component. Now, one path is looking outside the United States. So, or looking outside whatever market you're in. Different markets have different levels of uncertainty. And right now, we've got certain rules and laws in the EU that are probably a bit more stable, that might make the EU or parts of Asia a better environment to be an exporter. And you see this in other ways as well. I've been involved with another organization called CTC Global that makes a ultra high efficiency transmission wire. It's a U.S. company. They're based in California. They manufacture in California, but the vast majority of their installations are overseas. 100,000 miles of wire installed overseas, and so far only about 10,000 miles in the US. Just different markets, different policy environments that have made building the company and growing the technology outside the US first the right way to go. And you can see that sometimes in other technologies too. We've seen some of that with nuclear as well, where other markets, South Korea, France, even UAE to a certain extent, have created a policy environment that has made building new nuclear plants a little easier, a little faster, a little cheaper. And that is helping American nuclear companies learn how to do their business, build out scale, and be exporters of American technologies and American innovation. So I see that's as a real opportunity for the hydrogen space as well, and for ambient in particular. We're not
Uh,
talking that much about ambient, but I
well,
feel
I
like we
loved, it was a great segue. I love that you raised it, Miranda, because that's exactly the strategy that we're following here at Ambient. We believe that the US is going to be the global center for manufacturing, not just of the electrolyzer technology, but also of the tech for the sustainable aviation fuel, for the shipping fuel. And we're going to become a huge global exporter to the markets that you mentioned, whether it's Europe or Asia, as the way to sort of prove up that these technologies, not just that they work, but that they can occupy a meaningful part of the global fuels sector. And we can do it in a clean way and in a very low cost
Yeah.
way that creates lots of jobs here back home. So that's the name of the game.
Well, look, it's been a long, long, long time. I don't know how many hundreds of years, but it's been a long time since all energy was homegrown. It was probably back in the days when we were all cutting down trees for our fuel. So the global race for being energy leaders, energy technology leaders, energy fuel leaders, it's on and it's fierce, and we are in a massive, massive transition right now across the globe. And we as Americans have to recognize that other countries are fiercely going after hydrogen, both the fuels, the electrolyzers, all the components, and we have an opportunity to lead.
Yeah, I've been very encouraged my last couple trips to Capitol Hill to talk to lawmakers, mostly GOP lawmakers, and be able to say loud and proud, we have had some instances of energy technology where we have not come out on top in the
Mhm.
past. Let's win this one around clean
Right.
hydrogen,
That's
and
right.
that message really resonates.
Yeah,
So.
that's right. That's right.
Miranda, this has been wonderful. By the way, I almost neglected to mention we are so thankful and honored to have you as a member of our board of directors here at Ambient. So, one place that our audience can find more background on you is, of course, on the Ambient Fuels website. But where should we send some of our listeners who'd like to learn more about what you're working on so they can check in with you?
Well, the best place actually is good old fashioned LinkedIn. I'm not that active in the social media space, so LinkedIn is the best place. People can reach out to me there and see what I'm following and paying attention to there.
Awesome. All right, and that's a wrap on today's episode of the Great Green Upgrade. Thank you so much, Miranda. This was an awesome discussion with you. And for folks who'd like to learn more about Ambient Fuels clean hydrogen solutions, please come find us at ambientfuels.com.